When that great hand of discovery reaches out across the Atlantic to plant America, there are many fingers. Parliament and the Crown have an agenda, merchants another, and the Church of England has a missionary goal. England has run out of jobs, food, money, land, and trees, and here's a whole continent just waiting to be explored. To be missionaries, we need a couple of things. We need a Bible, a Book of Common Prayer, a piece of fair linen, and we need some silver for the communion table. As early as King James, early on, the clergy in the different churches in England were ordered to take up special collections, not just money, but they were to take up collections of silver and bonds and books, all the things they thought their brother clergy in the New World would need. If you have a Bible, a Book of Common Prayer, a piece of linen, and a little bit of silver, we can set up a church. Because everything else you need is either in your head or in your heart. And hopefully that physical stuff will help you get it started. So many of the pieces that come across were English. There are some fine silversmiths in England. And people knew what every church needed because everybody in England was pretty much going to the Church of England. They all took communion 3 or 4 times a year. They all knew what pieces had to be made. Paying for it frequently comes from what's called the Queen's bounty or the King's bounty. A lot of that money came from confiscated pirate ships. Clergymen who agreed to come to Virginia, or later Virginia men who studied for the ministry and went to England for ordination, received the King's bounty or the Queen's bounty to cover some of their expenses in reaching Virginia. The silver that comes across the ocean will be normally a paten to hold bread, a chalice to hold the wine. Sometimes there'll be a large tray. Sometimes there'll be a fancy basket. Now that big chalice, that's a lot to handle. Today chalices are considerably smaller, but those they're heavy and they're absolutely beautiful, but that's a lot of wine. I think those folks had a much different perspective on wine than we do. I really do. The silver is priceless, it is beautiful, and when I think of the hundreds of years of people who have taken the body and blood of Christ from that silver, it's a very touching thing, especially when you think back to the Last Supper and Jesus with 12 of his best friends with something not nearly so grand, not nearly so wonderful, but the same words of comfort and the same words of strength and promise, and the same invitation to be part of the body of Christ. Holy Communion was maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And in the Church of England, it was a very devout experience, a very ethereal, mystical. A lot of people think that we will never understand what happens during communion. And so as mere mortals, we ought to just stay away from it. People like George Washington, who didn't get confirmed, probably would automatically turn away because they would not have been confirmed. Other people would have turned away because they thought it was too papist, and they're not going to do anything that's too Catholic. So Holy Communion was a very big deal, but it was not something that everybody across the board would have done. And so many people would never have seen that silver. Some churches had pewter, some churches had pottery, some churches would use the best wheat bread they could find, and frequently the wife of one of the wardens would make the bread and then someone would provide the wine, and the vestry would not have an expense. In the church today, frequently a man and his wife, or a family, or several friends, bring elements up to the priest so that we are part of that offering. We don't have to cook the bread anymore because there are great communion companies who do all that sort of thing. Unlike the colonial period, communion is now offered each Sunday. Once upon a time, even when I was growing up, it was once a month. And in the colonial period, with the folks we're meeting this week, you had to be not only right with God, there's a prayer You must be in love and charity with your neighbor. And if you're not in love and charity with your neighbor, you're not to come and take communion. If you have committed some secret sin or some public sin, and you haven't been forgiven and you haven't made restitution, you're not to come to communion. If you have been excommunicated, which is quite literally stopped from the communion table, you can't take communion until there's been a reconciliation. And the clergy did and do have the power and the authority to excommunicate someone. So and it can happen if they see someone and they know for a fact that person has committed some terrible crime, they can stop them. And as I expect, they're bound by their oaths to stop them. It's frequently not a public thing. It's likely to be something the priest knows about and maybe the sinner knows about. We're all sinners in one way or another. But pretty often the clergy know who shouldn't be taking communion. But it's a matter of conscience. You must be in love and charity with your neighbor. And if I know I've done something that I shouldn't, I'm the one that has to stop before I get to the table. You know, that's part of the conscience. But in the colonial period, a lot of folks would have turned away. And those numbers we were talking about, you might have 300 people who belong in your parish and maybe 60 will take communion. That's a good number. It was very special. Now, somebody like Lady Gooch, that's the wife of Governor Gooch, has her own communion silver with her and in her inventory. It's called the Sacrament Cup, and it's silver gilt, a beautiful thing, all lacy and pretty. She had her own chaplain with her. Lady Dunmore brings her own chaplain with her. So these women, one can assume, were accustomed to having the sacrament privately at the palace. So to some people, Holy Communion was extremely important. And the first corporate act in the New World at Jamestown was Robert Hunt serving communion to all the folks at Jamestown. Another occasion for communion was when Christopher Newport was getting ready to go on a ship and go back home to England for a while to get more people and more supplies. And before they wished him a bon voyage, they made sure everybody had communion together. As much as we think of the Jamestown people as being tough guys and adventurers, they valued communion. One set of communion silver was given and put in the Jamestown church, and it was given by one of the royal governors. It was clearly marked, and both pieces say, "Mix not holy things with profane." In the early Middle Ages, there are different colors for the sacred and the profane. Sacred is almost always purple, the profane is almost always red or orange. And so the division between the two worlds, of course, in our behavior, in our psyche, in our actions, they come together. But when you go to the Lord's table, it should only be sacred that you're concentrating on. And so says the set that was used at Jamestown. Governor Morrison gave that one set. The second set of silver is from the period of George III. And that was a gift to the church from Lord Botetourt, who was Norburne Berkeley, the Baron de Botetourt. He was charming and he was lovely and he was a high churchman. In his personal life, I believe that he had very close Roman Catholic ties, partly because he fell in love with a Catholic girl, but he couldn't bring her here. And so Lord Botetourt is very close to the old traditions in his heart. And it was a sign of good manners when you go to a new place to bring a gift. So they brought communion silver. And it was going to be the very best. Lord Botetourt also gave money to the college. He endowed medals to the college. Lord Botetourt firmly believed in education and firmly believed in the future of the young people.